everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us for our last discussion of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Four Freedoms speech. This evening, we're going to be discussing the last of the four freedoms that President Roosevelt mentioned in that speech, freedom of speech. And this evening, my colleague Abigail Rupp is joining us. She joined the State Department's Foreign Service in 1997. She's a consular cone Foreign Service officer, and she has served overseas in Moldova, Ghana, Russia, Ethiopia, and Italy, as well as in Washington in the Bureau of Consular Affairs, as well as the Foreign Service Institute and the Office of the Deputy Secretary of State. Most recently, she was the Deputy Chief of Mission in Bucharest, Romania. Abby grew up in Columbia, Maryland, and Reston, Virginia. She has a bachelor's degree in Foreign Service from the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and a master's degree in Public Policy from George Washington University. She speaks Russian, Romanian, and Italian, and she is married to a diplomatic security special agent, and they have 3 lovely children, which I can attest to. Abby, please, over to you. We're really looking forward to your discussion this evening.
Great. Thanks, Monica, and lovely to be here tonight and to have the chance to talk about something that is very important to me and also something that's been part of my job as a diplomat for the past more than 20 years, and that is freedom of speech. So I have a few slides that will go along with what I'm talking about, and I think we could put the first one up. Lovely, thank you very much. So the concept of freedom of speech is nothing new. In fact, the concept was first tracked in the time of the ancient Greeks. There's a ancient Greek word called parrhesia, which means freedom of speech, or also means to speak candidly. So this word started appearing in Greek literature around the end of the 5th century BC. So this is a concept that has been originated at the time of one of the world's very first democracies. Next slide, please. This is a photo from the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial in Washington, D.C. That notes the 4 freedoms. And I know we've had programs on the other 3, and so I want to talk about the top one, freedom of speech. When President Roosevelt made his 4 freedoms speech to Congress in the middle of World War II, one of the things he said was that in the future days, which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. So I think one thing that's important to note here is that Roosevelt was not just talking about the US, he was talking about the importance of this freedom everywhere in the world. We can go to the next slide. Someone else who helped to illustrate this idea of the 4 freedoms was cultural artist Norman Rockwell. He did a series of 4 oil paintings illustrating these freedoms, and this is his painting on freedom of speech. And you'll notice that on the bottom, it says, buy war bonds. These were bonds that American citizens could buy to help invest in the war effort. And as part of this campaign that Norman Rockwell contributed his paintings to, the U.S. was able to raise more than $132 million from private citizens for the effort in World War II. And so again, this communication about the importance of freedom also was very important to Americans in the middle of war, in which we were fighting not just for our own freedom, but that of many other countries, including Russia. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a bit about, again, this foundation of freedom of speech. And this concept, just like it was in ancient Greece, has been a foundation of American government and American democracy. The very first amendment to the US Constitution, the first article of what we call the Bill of Rights, which were the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, talks about free speech. One piece of that amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise of religion, or abridging the freedom of speech. So, in other words, the government should do nothing to keep people from expressing their free speech. I want to talk about that a little more, in particular, because tomorrow is the anniversary of the ratification of the First Amendment. So the timing is quite good. So I also want to talk a little bit more about what this means to us today as Americans and as citizens of the world. What the First Amendment and the protection of free speech means in America is that our government may not jail people, fine people, or give any other penalty on people or organizations based on what they say or write, except in very exceptional circumstances. So to explain that a little bit more, even though the text of the First Amendment says Congress, our judicial system, up to the highest part of our judicial system, the Supreme Court, has said that speakers and organizations are protected against all government agencies and officials. So every part of the government, federal and local, executive, judicial, and elected officials. None of those institutions can keep us from speaking freely. What does that mean? If we get into a few more specifics, that freedom of speech and freedom of the press covers talking, writing, and printing. It also covers broadcasting, use of the internet, and other forms of expression. It also applies to symbolic expression. So that means things like flags. Even the burning of flags is protected under this amendment. Wearing armbands, any symbol that is an expression of an opinion cannot be banned by the government. Something else that is important to talk about the freedom of speech is that these types of speech are protected no matter the content, no matter what is said, again, except in very rare situations. So that would mean that any law that would prohibit people from criticizing a war or a government policy, anything that would prohibit people from opposing something like the right to health care, or someone's opinion on how the government should collect taxes or not collect them. All of those examples are protected under the right to free speech. So the idea is that our government should not limit what people can hear and what they can say and how they can form their opinions. That even includes offensive language. And as I'll note in a minute, it even also includes mistakes that the press might make. And in some cases, it also includes encouragement of illegal acts. So this protection is very, very broad. And it's very important to note that it is not limited to certain types of speech or certain people who make that speech. We can go to the next slide. Oops, my light went out. Hold on, there we go. So one example of how the freedom of speech protects the press comes from 1964. You'll see on the screen there's a clip of an article from the New York Times, which talks about support for the civil rights movement and was criticizing actions that the police had taken in Montgomery, Alabama, as part of efforts to suppress the right of people to vote, in particular African American people. The Public Safety Commissioner in Alabama sued the newspaper for libel. In other words, sued them because they had published false statements. Because it turned out that not everything in this advertisement was accurate about what was happening on the ground. The US Supreme Court decided that this newspaper article was protected under the right of free speech, even though there were mistakes in it that were made by the press, because the newspaper did not publish that information knowingly. They didn't do it on purpose. So the idea, again, is that the right to speak and the right to share information is protected even if there are unintentional errors in what is being shared. And the bottom line here, the idea here, is that these mistakes have to be protected if they're false, because we cannot discourage our citizens from criticizing their government. That is the foundational piece here, is that we have the right to criticize our own government. So does our press. The next piece of freedom of speech that I want to talk about is the right to protest. So protest is a form of free speech, and everyone under our Constitution has the right to protest. That doesn't mean that they have the right to cause harm to others or destroy property, but it does mean that the right to protest someone's individual opinion is completely protected. And these protests, peaceful protests, have been a part of American democracy from the very beginning and have had significant results. One series of protests that is just also celebrating 100 years is the freedom of speech and the protest for women's right to vote. So that right for women to vote was only granted in 1920. And that right, as well as the civil rights laws of the 1960s, would not have happened if people had not made their voices heard through the mechanism of public protest. The late Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, I think, said it very well. He said, defending free speech means defending not just free thought for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought that we hate. Think about that. It's not just freedom for people to speak their minds when we agree with what they're saying, but also, and in particular, when we disagree. Next slide, please. So I'd like to give you a personal example about freedom of speech and the freedom to protest. I think my parents would agree if I told you that I was raised by two hippies, two people who very much believed that individuals had the power to change the future of their country and to affect their government. And so part of my childhood upbringing was going to protests, going with my parents to demonstrations, to request usually a change in a government policy. So something, for instance, about the US intervention abroad, or equality for women, or the one that I want to talk to you about that you see on the screen called Hands Across America. You may have heard of an event that happened just before Hands Across America, which is We Are the World, the video that many US superstar singers recorded, a song that was written by Michael Jackson and Quincy Jones in a way with the goal of raising funds for a very tragic situation in Africa where people were starving. Hands Across America was another initiative to raise money for that same cause. And I was part of it. This event, as you can see, took place in May of 1986. And cities all across the US, large and small, created an event route, and people could sign up to be part of a human chain. When I was a kid, the part I was particularly excited about was that I got to get a t-shirt from the event. And so the money from the registration and for the sales of things like t-shirts would go to USA for Africa, which would again support this effort to help the hungry and the homeless in Northern Africa. So I remember this. I remember putting my shirt on and driving with my dad. I grew up near Washington, D.C., so we drove to Maryland, and it was a 2-lane highway, and we pulled off to the side, and we could see that there was already a line of people holding hands, certainly as far as I could see, already standing there. And so we parked and we got out, And we joined hands with other people. And I remember as a kid thinking, now what? Right, now what do we do? And what we did was we talked to the people around us, and we talked about why we were there and what was important to us, and what we hoped would come of this demonstration. And that's one of the things that I remember the most from this event, besides the t-shirt, was that I got to learn about the other people around me, and that I got to be a part of something that was trying to change the world, really, to change our government and to help other people. And that feeling of being part of a community and that feeling that an individual can make a difference is really what stuck with me as part of that experience. And in the end, this effort, this Hands Across America effort, raised $15 million. And it went, again, to support the effort against famine and homelessness in Northern Africa. And in a very interesting circle, as you might have heard in my biography, I served in Northern Africa, I served in Ethiopia. And so I'd like to think that my experience way back when I could bring with me then when I actually served in that country and continued to build those bridges between our country and the people of Ethiopia. So again, as a very small child, I learned it was my right and my responsibility to speak out about what was important and what I wanted to change. We can go to the next slide. I think we have one more slide. Okay, well, while we're getting that sorted out, what I want to finish with is talking a bit about Frederick Douglass, who was not just someone who was a former slave, but he was a reformer. He was an abolitionist. He was an orator, a writer, there we go, and he was a statesman. He grew up as a slave, and even as a slave, even as a very young man, he wanted to learn and to express himself. And he had to learn how to read and write in secret because slaves were not permitted to do that. He fought very hard for his own freedom when he finally escaped, and then for the freedom of his fellow people to stand up for human rights. And again, the quotation from him here is that liberty doesn't matter, freedom doesn't matter unless you can express your opinions. If freedom of speech is blocked, then it violates both parts of that conversation, the right of the person to listen and the right of the person to speak. Frederick Douglass was not afraid to speak out for what was right. He joined in many protests, including against the segregation of transportation and protests that supported the right to public education for all residents and citizens of America, and for land reform. He also joined with those I just mentioned, the people who were fighting for the right of women to vote. So there was a campaign, again, for women, but also for African American people to have the right to vote. And what he saw was that a violation of one person's human rights is the violation of all of ours. So Frederick Douglass was absolutely someone who stood up for the foundation of democracy. The last point I'd like to leave you with before we have a chance to answer any questions is some remarks from somebody else who was a leader in human rights, and that's Robert F. Kennedy. When he visited South Africa in 1966, he said something very similar. He said, hand in hand with freedom of speech goes the power to be heard. So if you have the right to speak, that means you have the right to be heard. And if you have the right to be heard, that means you have the right to participate in your government and shape the lives of your fellow countrymen. So thinking about freedom of speech as separate from democracy is not the full story. If we can share our opinions, that means our government has to listen to them as well. And that's why we have an election process and a democratic process. So with that, I'll turn it back over to our moderator and see if we've gotten any questions.
Thanks, Abby. That's all been really, really interesting and educational to listen to. And I really want to thank you for sharing your personal experience. I think that's it's great, and I'm sure that's a great interest to our audience. We have a couple of questions so far. We have two questions from Maria. Her first question is, does the government have to react to the protest? Clearly, protest is of great interest today. And then, so does the government have to react to the protest? And the second part of her question is, do people have to be authorized, have to get some sort of authorization to protest?
So to the first question, does the government have to react? There's no obligation for the government to react or even to do what is requested by the protesters. But the idea is that when people are making their voices heard, the government would really benefit from listening to those voices. You know, our Congress, again, they are elected officials, and many of them from our House of Representatives, for instance, they have to be elected every 2 years. And so they really have a strong interest in listening to the voters, because these are not just protests from citizens. They often think of it as the voice of the voters. And so they not only will follow what people are protesting against, for example, but also one other form of protest is to make phone calls to your representative, to your elected representative, and share your opinion. And they have people in their offices who tally, you know, on whatever the policy issue is. 42 people called in support, and 20 people called, not supporting this initiative. And so while the government is not obligated to respond to a protest, the government would do well to take those protests under consideration. The second question about do people have a permit, have to have a permit to protest? Again, because we have a federal system, that's going to be different depending on each city and each state in the U.S. In many cases, there is a need for a permit, but in some cases, there is not. In many of the larger protests, I think about, for instance, those that I attended as a child, we often went down to Washington, D.C., to the nation's capital. And because those were, in many cases, large amounts of people, not only did the organizers get a permit, but the city supported it with things like portable toilets, and ways to guide people to the right part where the event would be. And so there is, in general, there is a way for our government to support these protest initiatives.
While we wait for our audience to come up with a couple more questions, I wanted to ask you, since there is a lot of interest in protests as a form of free speech, can you talk a little bit about the protests that are currently getting a lot of attention in the United States, the Black Lives Matter protests, the Proud Boys, a lot of what went on this past summer, for example? Mm-hmm.
Certainly. So what we saw this summer and in the previous couple of years really focused on Black Lives Matter is an initiative by a part of the American population that believes that these certain issues have not been taken seriously by the government. And so these protests have been designed to call attention to the concern of the lack of equality, the fact that the government was not taking concerns about, for instance, police behavior and police rules seriously. And so these protests were a really groundswell of concern from all over the country. And as a result of those protests, many parts of our government have started looking very closely at the issues that have been raised. And then similarly, often when there is a group of people expressing one opinion, as I mentioned, people who disagree with that opinion have the right to express themselves too. And so that's what we've been seeing as well, with the demonstrations by groups like the Proud Boys or other organizations. Again, everyone has a right to express their opinion. What is not protected under the Constitution is doing harm to others in expression of that opinion. So reports of any kind of destruction, anything like that, again, is not something that is protected under free speech, because the idea is you can express your opinion, but you should not be causing other laws that protect property, for instance, to be broken. So there is a balance there, and it's very important.
Thanks, Abby. I have another question. What should the government do when one person's freedom of speech violates another person's rights?
Well, it'd be great if that caller had an example from that. But the idea is that everyone has a right to speak. So again, I mentioned the Supreme Court has even protected cases where people are speaking and encouraging illegal actions. So that's actually quite interesting. But again, there's a line between encouraging an illegal action and encouraging harm to others. And I think that would be where the line would be. It's not, if someone says something that offends you, that is not a violation of your rights. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with them, but you have to allow them to speak. Because think about the alternative, right? The alternative is that only people who agree with you can share their opinions with you. The alternative is that we don't get to have conversations out in the open about things like Black Lives Matter. We don't get to have conversations in the open about racism, about economic inequality, that we don't have the opportunity to talk about these things. So that's why there are a couple of very interesting examples over the past few years where a city granted a permit for a demonstration of the Ku Klux Klan. So the choice there would be not let them demonstrate, right, or allow them to demonstrate. And if you block that demonstration, then you also block the opportunity for dialogue.
Thanks, Abby. In your foreign service career, have you seen examples of how the United States works to promote freedom of speech overseas? I just recall I was serving at an embassy and there was a protest, and it was very important that the protesters' manifesto be physically accepted by a representative from the US Embassy, because they were coming to the US Embassy because we promote free speech. So I'm just wondering if you could share any examples from your experience with the audience.
Certainly. I can think of one offhand. In my last assignment, when I worked at the US Embassy in Romania, we had quite frequent protests by a group of Palestinians who were advocating, again, for the state of Palestine. And there would generally be a demonstration outside of the embassy, very peaceful. And there would also generally be one of our diplomats who would go out and as you said, Mecca, receive the manifesto, receive the statements. And we would share those with our headquarters as well. And in many cases, we also send those in official reports, because part of our job is also to understand where those opinions are, because we too listen to the opinions of other countries and other groups of people who have input and would like to share their opinion on US policies abroad. And so so that conversation is important both in the US and overseas, absolutely.
Thanks, Abby. We have another question from the audience. Oh, we have a few. Another question from Maria, who gets a gold star for asking questions. And she wants to know, in the context of the Four Freedoms speech, what is freedom of want?
So freedom from want is the ability to have enough to survive. So the idea that President Roosevelt shared was that we should all be allowed to have the basic minimum support. So you could think of freedom from want, for instance, in the idea of social services, again, in economic inequality, another way to talk about freedom from want. There is also one philosopher, a US-based philosopher named Henry Shue, who also talks about basic rights. And one of the basic rights that Henry Shue talks about is exactly this. It's the right to sustenance, right? The right to basic, water and nutrition.
I think when we had our first presentation a few weeks ago about freedom from want, we talked about that in the context of Thanksgiving because it was Thanksgiving week. But I think perhaps it's a bit of a misrepresentation to talk about such a feast when really it is talking about such a basic right. So thank you for that. We have another question from the audience. It's a bit long, so I'm going to try to paraphrase it for you. It's from Baris, and he's asking about, are there foundations, presumably in the United States, that support educational projects and research to talk about the legacy of educational discourse as it relates to freedom of speech?
There are, and there are those kinds of institutions that have a whole range of opinions about what education should look like. And it's actually a very interesting question when you look at how we teach our history. Because when we're talking about the importance of freedom of speech, we're also talking about our classrooms. I think that's a very good point. And how do we encourage that same kind of conversation in classrooms? And how do teachers present history as accurately and as in an unbiased way as possible? There have been some conversations recently, for instance, about how we in the U.S. teach the U.S. Civil War. What were the causes of the Civil War? What's the legacy of the Civil War? And this also intersects, interestingly, with what we just talked about in terms of Black Lives Matter. The idea that many people would see history as written by those who are in power. But what about the people who are not in power? How does their history play into how we see our country? And I think it's a particular American virtue that despite the challenges we have, we are not afraid to admit that we have also made mistakes as a country. And I think that conversation is really important to have. And those foundations, as well as the presidential foundations of former presidents like John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan, play a really big role in having those conversations.
Okay, we're starting to get more questions. We have one from Be Kind, Have Passion, asking whether there should be efforts to exercise rights, presumably the rights to freedom of speech in other countries, countries such as Russia, Iran, other places that have a different history, whereas the US was really founded on this principle of the aspiration of free speech at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly we from the US government believe that there should be, and we have programs and policies that support that. One of those, for instance, is the Voice of America program, which has for years shared information in as unbiased a way as possible to give people, again, another point of view about what is happening either in their country or in the US. And we have a number of programs all around the world where we support journalists. For instance, we have many academic exchange programs where we try to increase that conversation. And we also have some really interesting programs where we support teachers going to the US, for instance, to get some tools in teaching things like history or entrepreneurship even, which all intersect with people's freedom to speak, but also people's freedom to choose what business and what economic path their country should take.
Okay, bit of a personal question for you from Ludmila. Hi, Abby. What part of your job is the most inspiring to you?
Well, I would say, I've spent a good chunk of my career working in what we call consular work. Consular officers have two main responsibilities, and this is true not just of U.S. consular officers, but all around the world, including Russian consular officers. We do two things. One, we help our citizens overseas, and two, we help with immigration or anyone who wants to come to the U.S. to study. And I think some of the most rewarding parts of my job have been in those two categories. So, for instance, assisting victims of trafficking, or when I was working in Ethiopia, I mentioned I worked there, helping to ensure that children who didn't have a family, who were eligible for adoption, were matched with a family in the U.S., while making sure that that system wasn't taking advantage of people who maybe could be tempted to break the rules. And so I think what I like about that part of my work over the years is that I can see that we can really assist people often in their hour of need. One time in a really challenging situation, I was the only representative to the funeral of an American citizen who had died overseas. His family couldn't be there. And so to have that honor to be this person's family's person on the ground, and to ensure that their family member was well taken care of, you don't have a greater honor than that.
Okay, a question back to freedom of speech about, do you think you need to pay your own price to have that freedom? So I think this gets back to what you were saying, quoting Frederick Douglass, about this is a freedom for the thought that we hate, as well as, our own thought. So if you could talk about that a little.
I think we have to be prepared to pay a price. There are examples like Frederick Douglass, and I would say even Robert F. Kennedy, right, who were not afraid to speak, and were putting themselves at risk for doing that. And I think any right, any freedom is something that we should be prepared to protect. So yes, I think one of the important parts of democracy is that it's not about what the government can do for you. It's not about what one person will do. It's about the obligation that all of us have to take that into our own hands. And that maybe that means, participating in a protest, but maybe that just means voting, right? Maybe it just means making our voice heard in that way. Maybe that means ensuring that we are properly educating ourselves and our children and our family about the information that is available to us. So we all have an obligation, and some of us do pay a heavier price than others, unfortunately.
Okay, a question from the audience member. Do you think that the modern generation isn't yet responsible enough for freedom of speech?
Well, no, I would say that things like the Black Lives Matter movement that we've seen, and a number of the relatively newly elected members of Congress, again, from both parties in the US, show that the younger generation is very engaged and does believe that things can change. I think examples such as the fact that there are a number of, sorry, my light keeps going off, a number of campaigns, political campaigns in the US, where the vast majority of campaign donations were small ones, like $5 or $10. That says that there are people of the younger generation as well as the older generation who believe that what they do makes a difference. So I think actually this generation, and there have been plenty of articles about it, is more activist than perhaps the generation before.
You touched on something that I think is very uniquely American, this idea of grassroots support and these small $5 donations for a candidate. The candidate you think best, symbolizes your thought, and that's a way of exercising freedom of speech. But I think that's a very American thing, and it really, as far as I know, this mobilization, usually using social media, really came about in 2007, 2008, when President Obama was initially running for office. So yeah, I think this idea of using social media as a tool for this kind of grassroots activism is definitely a new concept. I just wanted to ask on the other side of that coin, I think social media has shown us that it's very easy to create your own echo chamber, right? If you're only interested in following or engaging with people who have a similar point of view to you. So I don't know if you have anything you want to comment about that, because you were talking about how when you were able to go to a protest, or when there is a protest or a counter protest, it's about face-to-face engagement and discussion, but it's quite easy to avoid that nowadays.
I think it's a challenge. And I think while social media is great, I think you're right. I think it can allow us to create our own bubbles. And so part of our responsibility then is to be a little self-aware about that, and to think about what biases we're confirming by listening to only what we agree with, and to be willing to have conversations with people that you think you won't find anything in common with, because there are tons of, for instance, scientific studies that indicate that people who have a certain bias adjust that bias when they meet somebody from either that ethnic group or that political belief. Having an idea that's abstract is very different from knowing somebody and talking to somebody. And I think, well, especially during this year when it's been so hard for us to have personal engagement, it's even more important for us to try to question our own assumptions. It's not easy.
No, and I think unfortunately the internet allows us to say things in a way we would not say to someone's face, and the decorum that you would have engaging is out the window. But thanks for your thoughts on that. I'm not seeing any more questions right now. I invite the audience to go ahead and submit if they have any more questions for Abby on freedom of speech or the four freedoms generally. I think this has been such a great opportunity to discuss this. I think there's a reason, obviously, that freedom of speech is the First Amendment outlined in the Bill of Rights. And it was the first of the four freedoms that President Roosevelt mentioned. And I think there's so many different ways that this freedom gets interpreted and applied in so many different aspects of our society, that it's been really nice to have a moment to reflect on the history of it and also how it's being interpreted in modern times. While we wait for any more questions, is there anything else you wanted to share?
So I did think of something else that I hadn't thought of before about speech. I am a very big fan of rock and roll music, and in particular, I'm kind of an embarrassingly big fan of the Rolling Stones. And one of the real joys of the first time I ever lived in Russia, which was as a student in the late 90s, was going to see some of the classic Russian rock bands like Akvarium. And I got to see Akvarium in person, which is very cool. And I listened to DDT and some of the kind of old school, right, Russian rock bands. And what they did was also speech, right? They used the language of music to share opinions, to push against the government, to stretch for additional freedom. And one of the great stories of the US-Russian relationship is how we've used music to communicate with each other, from jazz, right, from Dave Brubeck and the Jazz Ambassadors to Billy Joel, who came to Russia in 1989. There have been lots of ways that we have expressed ourselves and Russians have expressed themselves through music, because speech isn't just protests and newspapers, right? It's also art. And so I was just thinking about that, about there are lots of ways for us to talk to each other and share our opinions, including music.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's one of the great ties that we have with Russia and with other countries. And this expression and culture is something that's so powerful. And I think in this year of not going to museums or anything, it's easy to or concerts or anything, it's easy to kind of forget. But some of the most powerful statements I've ever seen have been paintings or, photographs, visual, or that musical aspect. So that's a great point. Also film, I think.
Absolutely.
Great films from the Soviet era that, were made by dissidents. So there's a lot of great examples of that. All right, I am not seeing any more questions come through. But I really wanted to thank you so much for your time and for sharing your knowledge with us and for sharing your personal experiences with us. That's really great to hear from you about that. And we will definitely be using your musical knowledge in the future because I'm sure our audience wants to hear more about that.
Count me in.
But unless there's anything else you'd like to say, I'd like to thank the audience for joining us, and a huge thanks to AMC for hosting and to Abby for speaking with us this evening.
It was my pleasure. Thanks very much. Thanks to everyone for joining.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.